There. Oh, they logged off.
Yeah.
Is Mark actually here, do we know, or is he at home? Both of these.
Mark is virtual.
He's
Mark-
virtual.
She's virtual,
online.
okay. Who is virtual? So there you go.
Hi, I'm Lisa Pedigo, and I'm attending to report back to the Lake Forest Park Stewardship Foundation, and I just wanted to see your meeting.
Welcome.
All right, well. We seem to have everybody here is going to be here. I call the meeting to order. Does anybody have a reflection to offer? Mark, you're the most reflective person here, I think, so.
I do, very, very brief. I was just thinking, this is an interesting time for in the life cycle of trees in a forested area. And it occurs to me this time of year when I drive down Perkins Way, how many shades of green there are. How many different shades of green? I think a lot of it has to do with new leaves coming out, or do they change color as they mature? Start out paler and become fuller. I was struck by that. And I was also struck by the pollen. On your car windows. The car window, on the car board, on my roof, on my deck, everywhere. And I was cleaning the deck today, swept it up, cleaned it, not the deck, the car. It's so thick out there, you kind of slide on it. It's like it's slippery, like walking on ice.
That's mostly Douglas fir pollen.
Is it, that's what I was wondering, is it?
I don't know what it is, but it's just sticky. It doesn't just wash off my car, it just sits there.
Yeah. Anyway, and I was, both Sarah and I were using eye drops for a couple of days, and I think we're over the worst of it right now. And for 2 weeks there, it's really intense.
Alder pollen, which comes in like February, is what gets my eyes and nose, but this recent spate of pollen from conifers, that's bothered me.
It's not terribly allergenic, I don't think, for pollen.
Usually doesn't bother me either, but I know that my eyes are feeling a little gritty. a couple of
There's so
times.
much of it.
My wife gets a lot of allergy problems when the cottonwood comes up. I mean, you know, it's not the cottonwood because the giant things. But something else that does flower during the cottonwoods gets her then.
Well, that's my reflection. Right, we reflect, but it's an interesting time of the year.
We have one visitor, so should we introduce ourselves here?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Stacy?
Oh, I'm Stacey Spade, member of the tree board since February of this year.
I'm Dick Olmsted, I'm member of the tree board for 5 years now.
Victoria Kutas, member since beginning of this year as well.
Doug Sprugel, chair and member since about a year after Dick, I think.
Mark Phillips, I'm the vice chair of the tree board.
Larry Goldman, city council liaison to the tree board for the last 2.5 years.
I'm Elizabeth, I'm assistant planner of the city of Lake Forest Park.
Mark
Mark Hoffman, CD Director at Lake Forest Park.
and Drew.
Drew Morris, Urban Forest Planner for Lake Forest Park.
I guess Lisa's already introduced herself, so. All right, adoption of the agenda. Anybody have any objections to the agenda or want to make any changes?
I move adoption.
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the agenda is adopted. Minutes. Does anyone have any comments or suggestions for the minutes?
they look okay to me.
I think I have one question. I was what, let's see, on line 28 of page 1. March 2024.
Yeah, we're not gonna have that. We're not gonna have March.
Uh-huh.
We're not gonna have March.
Oh, March is table. Oh, okay. I'm glad it's something.
It's a good point.
I assume that referred to Oh, I don't know.
Maybe it was a discussion of the tree list that we were working on.
No, the tree list was further down.
It's discussed further down, so I don't know if that,
We should take it out.
it's something important, maybe we'll remember.
That's, I think, the minutes of March. So in the April meeting,
Oh,
we tabled the March. minutes.
But that's,
But just above there, it says we approved the March minutes.
right.
Yeah,
So I don't know what we would have tabled.
I can remove that.
Probably a good idea.
Okay.
'Cause I don't recall I'm not entirely sure what tabling means, but I'm pretty sure we didn't do it.
Yeah.
I have an idea. what it is.
all we could have done.
Tabling would mean that you postponed it to the next meeting.
Oh,
The meeting minutes were not that exciting that we need to.
Sometimes though, they aren't prepared yet.
There's
They
that.
need to be, we need to wait a month to approve.
I think we had it done. We had it done.
Well, if all the thoughts, I would move adoption with that, modification.
Now, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Moving right along. Any public comments? Lisa, did you want to make a further comment or just, we know who you are and why you're here and thank you for attending?
No, just thank you all for your work on the tree board.
Thank you. Okay. Communication and communications. But we never know quite what it is.
If I have an update, is that under communications or is that reports and announcements?
We used to do your report from the council under reports and at the end. And communications were more about things from the city that were pertaining to the council or to the board. I don't recall like that. It has been a confusing line item on the agenda.
Right, we could consider just getting rid of the communications item, but are there situations where we would want to have something from the city announced early on, or? There might be.
Sometimes at planning commission and city council, you get a letter from a different agency, something that's not on the agenda, something that's addressed to the tree board, we would normally bring it up under item 7. So, but it doesn't happen with tree board very frequently, if at all.
But I can see a situation where a report from the council might be really important to some of our newer old business.
To have it before the other.
Yeah. And by the way, also, if you were talking about, you don't need to do that, if the council has already decided,
Yeah.
would be terrible as item 11.
I would recommend just scrapping 10, combining it into 7 and making 7 reports, announcements and communications, something like that, moving forward.
We often do announcements like new staff or new board members, things like that at that early point in the agenda.
Since we often run out of time at the end.
Okay. Okay, why don't we try making 7 communications reports and announcements, Elizabeth, and then
okay.
shorten our meetings by not having reports and announcements as a separate item. You said with incredible optimism. All right.
On
Now,
that note, do we have anything from the council?
I didn't read 8C, so no, my announcement was gonna be that we approved the task force, but that'll be 8C. So, no, nothing for me.
Do we have any updates on if there are more new applicants for the board?
Yes, I know Betsy's, application was reviewed by the city clerk. They're just waiting on the mayor to schedule an interview with her. But the mayor's just really caught up with the new camera they're installing. So,
Actually, I can explain what that. So the council yesterday had a special meeting. We approved, so there's a school camera on 178th by Brookside Elementary. The council approved upgrading it to, so during school hours, it'll be a school zone speed camera. Outside of school hours, it'll be a regular speed camera. So it's 20 miles an hour during school, 25 during other times. But that required special council action. It was time sensitive because state law is changing next month.
So the announcement that came out by email suggested that it was gonna be a longer section 178 that was subject to that speed camera. Is that not the case? It's just gonna be the same
Oh.
camera?
It's the same 2 cameras, one at the east end, one at the west end. It's just that they're gonna be on 24/7 instead of just school hours. But that took a lot, because that had to be rushed, there was a lot of effort to get that done on time. And so the mayor was very busy with that, so wasn't able to do any tree board or any other applicant interviews.
I believe they said next week they'd like to interview. with her.
What's the person's name again, Elizabeth?
Her name's Betsy Orman.
Okay, she's mentioned in the minutes.
Yeah.
And she, I think, attended a meeting at the end.
Yeah.
I was here last week.
Our last.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Okay.
The minutes say that Tom has something like that, Hazlet expressed an interest, did he follow through on that?
He submitted an application too. It's just kind of the same issue. That interview with the mayor. that they're
Sure, so
waiting.
you know.
Yeah, that's correct. I gave him a call after the last meeting, talked with him, and all nominations are with the mayor.
And we had somebody who came to the Ivy thing who expressed an interest, but I guess at this point, he might actually be an alternate, for given heads, it's like.
It'd be okay to get alternates.
It'd be okay to get alternates, yes.
His name was Anthony, but the sign on sheet probably has his last name. Possibly.
I mean, I told him
Yeah.
how to watch this meeting or come to this meeting if you wanted to. I encouraged him to. Kind of in his hands.
Yeah.
And an abundance of riches would not be a bad thing when it comes to tree board members.
If the board would like, and you gave me his contact information, I can reach out to him in the interim, get an application and so forth, get it going.
We collected name and general, like either address or cross streets. We did not collect contact info because we didn't know if there was anything we would do with contact info. And I don't like collecting it just for funsies, so.
Thank you.
Okay, so you'll have to get in touch with us. All right, on to the comprehensive plan. So we need to allow time after our discussion to talk about the Arbor Day and the climate policy advisory team discussion. How long will the climate policy team take? Do you have any sense of what? Are you just reporting, or do we need to discuss issues, or?
We had two people interested in that I think we need to decide who's gonna be our representative.
Okay.
Maybe.
Didn't you have questions about how much time it would take?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
And it sounded like you had some updates on.
Well, mainly, I think just timekeeping, I think right, without getting into discussing the task force. If you want to set, what time do you want to stop talking about the comp plan? And then move on to Arbor Day Recap and advisory board.
Right, but how long we leave the comprehensive plan depends a little on how long we need to spend on the other things.
Okay, yeah, I suspect the Arbor Day Recap will be pretty quick, and then I think, would you say, Mark, like 10 minutes to discuss the advisory?
So.
Yes.
20 of or earlier.
Okay, so I'll keep an eye out.
Thank you. All right. On to the comprehensive plan, I would like to point out for anybody who didn't notice this, because I didn't notice it until the last minute. This is dated April 3rd, but this is in fact an update from what we had last month. That incorporates at least some of the changes we talked about. I don't know about all of them, I didn't get a record of the changes on it, but it's not actually the same thing as last month. We do have, this is the updated version.
Are you sure?
I'm sure some parts were updated, yeah.
I did make edits to it, but I did forget to change the date.
So the April 3rd, you looking at the meeting packet for tonight, though?
Yeah, I am.
Okay, maybe I didn't take a careful enough look. I thought it was a reiteration of the stuff that Mark pulled together for us.
Well, I thought it is mainly that, of course.
Okay.
But there is a note on, the thing that I noticed on here is that policy EQ-9.4 says we maintain the tree board, not we set one up.
Yeah.
We maintain the tree board, and that's one of the things we did talk about last week, and that was one of the very noticeable things that we changed and memorable. So should we just do what we did last time and sort of go through it from the top?
Yeah,
and
I guess
see
double
who actually
check
gets.
if things got incorporated or not.
Yeah, and again, I don't have notes on what we said, so I can't actually check on that. All right. Does anyone have any comments on, well, let's say the introduction?
before we go on, I think it would be a good idea, and I don't know who the person could be to do this, probably the board chair, although Elizabeth could take responsibility for some time in advance of these meetings, or maybe at each meeting, at the end of the meeting, we should have action items that we want board members to, do or look at or take up before the next meeting, and then be reminded of it.
Right.
And I make this statement because I didn't go back over looking at this since the last meeting, and should have, and it would be, it just, so in my mind, it would be nice to be reminded of what, items we maybe should come prepared to discuss. I mean, Elizabeth sent out the agenda and the packet. I should have taken responsibility at that point.
Well, I said it, well, I've already seen it, it's April 1st, and I've seen it, I'll just take a quick glance through it, and then
Yeah,
on my quick glance through it, I said, oh, that's different. So then I realized it was at least something,
Yeah.
at least somewhat updated.
Yeah.
So,
so. Actually, I should take that comment back, because I think Elizabeth sending us the packet, 3 or 4 days in advance should be enough warning, and it's on me to make sure that I do that.
For a university professor. Well, we could ask her to be a little tougher,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I could put it in the email kind of worded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I support action items, right?
Yeah.
Action items for the report.
Yeah, I can incorporate that.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah,
so
But
we would identify those at the end of the meeting to do it in the next month.
We usually do talk about it sort of amongst ourselves, sort of what's for the next report. But we don't sort of delineate
I mean,
everything we need to do in advance.
well, ideally, of course, the action items would not be. When you're reminded the action items 3 days before the next meeting, that wouldn't be the time you'd start working on them all over the many pieces. We will, but never,
Good point. Yeah.
so maybe after the meeting, Elizabeth can send out an email saying, these are the action items for the next meeting. Again, that'll be a month before we actually do it, but still.
Yeah, some of them do need advance work.
Yeah.
Prep, while others, you just need to find an hour or two to sit down. And
Right,
do something.
right. But
could I just ask before we jump in too deeply, where we are in this process now? My understanding was we're kind of getting near the end of the input process. And that maybe to set a tenor for our conversation over the next hour on this.
It would, as in regard to the tree board, you're on track. So it's a 2-year process due in December of this year. For 2024, we're focused on planning commission through June. The possibility of revising, wordsmithing, adding policy, commenting runs through until city council holds a public hearing and adopts the final draft. The focus right now is I can't believe it's May and June at Planning Commission, because these are existing elements and can be updated when we circulate to the public a then current draft in June for a public hearing at Planning Commission. And so you have this list of existing goals, policies that can be reviewed and suggested amendments we could add. The one comment that I remember from the last meeting was 2 policies in the iTree report that could get carried through that aren't reflected in there now, but more or less these policies and goals reflect the future. And so the fine tuning and detail from this meeting or even in June could make it into that planning commission draft quite easily through Elizabeth and Andrew, to SCJ and Christina, and reviewed by the planning commission. In
Okay,
July, we're
okay.
hoping to go to city council.
Yeah.
But Mark, you will have the fun of doing the last meeting to deal with this. I'm not gonna be here next month, so.
Okay. Well. Okay.
Finish tying all the bows.
Okay, well, good. So we don't need, so we should probably look towards the consensus on as much as we can tonight, if we have stuff to discuss, and but realizing that we probably have that little more cushion to finance. Think about it.
All right, so Anything to say in the introduction? Well, as Mark said last time around, there's really a very good document, and the city's goals haven't changed, at least as I would like to see the city's goals, haven't changed that much in 10 years. I was personally impressed at how good the goals of 10 years ago look, not having even been in the city at that point. Anyway, so anything in the introduction anybody wants to comment on or suggest changes to, or? Okay, the land use element. For me, it's just like the middle part of page 2.
I have just one wording change for policy LU-3.1. It says encourage the integration of natural landscape and new development by including both natural and compatible ornamental plant shrubs and trees.
Right.
I think that word natural should be native. I think that's the intent there, not.
Yes, yes. And I think on the one right, the next one, 3.2, we suggested the term groves instead of clusters. Unless there's some unique reason why clusters makes more sense there.
But groves is already, that's one of the changes that
One of
already
the
made.
things we got made.
It was already,
Yeah.
okay. So you gotta keep a couple eyes going here.
Groves is actually in, I'm pretty sure Groves is in the municipal code now, so
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what it says about the model, I haven't read it very carefully. It was discussed before I started. There is something here that I wondered about last time, and I don't recall what we said. Provide for a smooth transition between differing land uses through landscape buffers, site, and building design measures. I'm not really quite sure what that means.
There's not much regulation in Lake Forest Park, and I'd be guessing as to why. Some cities have buffer requirements of different types, type 1, type 2, type 3, where they can detail the width or the density or the vegetation type of a buffer between two either semi-consistent or inconsistent land uses. A classic example is between a multifamily apartment and the back of a shopping center. Lake Forest Park has some limited, maybe in the future it should be explored, but there's no large-scale redevelopment envisioned for Lake Forest Park. It's predominantly single family. We're going to deal with middle housing, and town center has just been discussed.
Okay, so that's,
So probably okay as it is.
yeah, it's okay today. That's it. It's not really a big tree board deal. All right. We certainly recognize and support tree preservation number 3.3 as an integral part of the community character. We could put that in all caps, which might be up to me, but
Yeah.
the second thing, environmental quality goals, environmental quality and shoreline elements.
I have to be careful here because I had a few left.
A quick comment on policy E2 4.2, promote retention of, we also want to qualify that with native vegetation and limit land disturbance.
Frankly, any vegetation in there is important. It's a matter of root strength and things like that.
I think the emphasis here is to avoid removing vegetation in those
No matter what.
environments. Yeah, to retain what is there.
Because it takes a long time for it takes a long time for a newly planted tree to develop enough root strength to keep prevent a landslide
Yeah.
or slippage or anything like that. So maintaining the stuff that's there is
Well, I just feel like it might encourage people to leave things that we would otherwise want them to. Like invasives. But it wouldn't.
well, you
have
know,
to
in my
be
own,
here.
to be really honest, Stacey, in my own backyard, I'd rather have value than nothing.
Yeah,
Which I've got a steep area in my backyard, it's about like this.
yeah.
Not big enough to be pretty clear, it's steep, and having something on there is important.
Mhm.
And I think it's already captured. 4.2 is under a different goal. It's under goal 4, which is less focused on natural and native. Goal 1 is focused on natural environment and has the words preserve native and compatible vegetation wherever appropriate.
Got it. That's a helpful qualification mark.
9.1. Just double checking now that I understand what this document is. So it's established by the municipal code through regular evaluation, which was changed that we talked about last week. The previous version said it was established in the forest management plan.
Okay.
So that was a change that got made. Thank you.
Anything else in this element?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get my mind. What is 9.7? 9.7. Develop a vigorous program to control invasive plant species. Okay. I would say. Oh, I don't know. I was suggesting maybe we want to add the word removal in there. A program to remove and control invasives.
With that change.
Because we really want to promote I think, well, what is control? It's what we did the other day, control.
Yeah, I think of control in the sense of invasives as remove.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it implies it to me. I mean, there are some invasives that you just want to trap. I've got some in my yard that, you know, getting them out is impossible, but I can at least keep them out of certain areas.
I think you need the word remove, because control means you can just take a hedge clipper and just kind of like. Control it from like spilling over.
Remove has to do with roots.
Yeah,
Remove
Not a
the,
cake.
final.
Eviscerate.
So we can add the word remove in there.
Sure.
Let's add it, not replace, so, because I think.
Yeah.
Remove and
Agreed.
control. And do we want to say develop? We just had a vigorous program to remove ivy, so maybe we want to change some other word than develop. Continue efforts to control.
I feel like that was one of the words we talked about last time and determining that. Well, an event is not a program.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So
And we don't really have a program. Program would be something that we have,
coordinated and ongoing.
yeah. What we've done so far is a couple of events.
The Stewardship Foundation has a program, but
More like efforts.
Yeah, right, the stewardship program.
I think at two parks we do in conjunction with
Yeah.
the city, for the approach.
Right.
Cause we're doing it, monthly and throughout the year.
maybe you would like to have them then change it to continue the program. It's like, I would say you've developed one, frankly. I would say this goal has been achieved. From what I know, what you guys do, and that if you just continue efforts to control and remove it.
The taxonomist in me would like to see laurel and holly have modifiers with them, so cherry laurel and European holly. Because there are other species of laurel and holly that are not invasive. That are grown as ornamental.
The other thought I had is you could change the language to say like whatever noxious weeds are established by, the county, or if there's a set list that changes, just because we never know what else could be added to that as well.
That's true, that's good.
I support that, Drew.
So.
Yeah.
Designated noxious weeds, state designated or county designated noxious weeds.
That's
instead
sort of,
list.
the only downside to that is it dilutes what we may think of as the primary noxious weeds that we have to deal with here, but some are not relevant.
The only advice I would offer is that this is meant to be sort of like a 30,000-foot view. So I would personally avoid specific details and just focus on the generalities, that rather than naming specific species or a specific list, just talk about wanting to control and remove invasives and noxious species. And then leave it to the ordinances and other plan to actually give the specifics.
Sounds like consensus.
Yeah, sounds
Yeah.
good, yeah. You know, Mark or anybody else?
I got one, but it's not on this list. It's EQ, it's in EQ3. And in EQ3, and it would be a new one. And it has to do with planting for shade around streams. This EQ3 is water quality protection, right? And so, and it's, I think in addition, I think one that could be added to that would be, what did I say? It isn't good, right? Encourage the planting of trees and shrubs in riparian zones to help cool stream water. Something to that effect. So it'd be a new one under EQ3, if that sounds okay to people.
What does EQ3 read?
EQ3 is water quality protection.
That makes good sense to me.
Good sense to me to plant trees there.
Okay, thank you.
I think of most of our streams in Lake Forest Park are fairly wooded and shaded already, but
Yeah.
that's, it's for an overview document, that would make sense to include it.
Yeah.
Well, and, you know, if development strips vegetation away from the stream,
Yeah,
it's even more important to have protection for the stream than the other areas. You know, if somebody cleared a lot of area for doing something and then has to declare it, the stream banks are probably the most important thing to get replaced. Well, it's making critical areas, I guess.
So something like that is okay. I'm thinking of another one too, and a new one possibly under EQ6. EQ6 is air quality, noise abatement, and light pollution. And it's not listed in here, but I know that there was a lot of research done into the effects, the negative effects of shoreline lighting and dock lighting. And I know the city council put out some information about that because I was instrumental in bringing it back from the Salmon Recovery Council. Some
Yeah.
research that was done. So the idea would be to, when I was just roughing out something like educate lakeshore residents about the need to minimize or eliminate shore and dock lighting to reduce predation on migrating juvenile salmon. All of the salmon that come out of Lake Sammamish, Issaquah Creek and Bear Creek come around the north end of the lake. And they seek refuge in places, and lighting at night helps predators find them. Is what the research has shown. So, and I know that there was some information that was sent out to dockside people at that time, but a couple of years ago. But so I'm suggesting adding another one under EQ6, Mark.
I could get the exact wording for the next version. I'll make a note of it.
Can you
Okay. Or you'll repeat it or
I'll
just
talk-
catch it later?
I'll talk with you and then the next iteration will have the exact wording. We don't have to, I'm not good
Okay.
at taking notes, but I took a note to talk with you.
Yeah,
And it may be in the draft SMP update that is kind of waiting in the wings.
is there anything in EQ6 about promoting dark sky and minimizing night lights in our community?
Well, what does it say? Educate citizens about noise, air pollution from gas powered. Promote dark skies, EQ 6.3.
Good.
Promote dark skies through measures to encourage reduced light trespass. And use of lighting appropriate to the task.
I feel like that should be sent out in a newsletter.
Yeah.
You mean everyone isn't reading the whole comprehensive?
Yeah,
plan?
exactly. That's such a hidden.
There's somebody in our neighborhood who has spotlights radiating out from every side of their house.
Oh,
And I feel like going up telling the person, you wouldn't put, speakers blaring loud music on the side of your house. You wouldn't put a
yeah.
you know, a sprinkler system that's spraying water onto your neighbor's house
Yeah.
at night, why do you have lights that are
It's so
shining on your
disruptive.
neighbor
Are they on all the time or are they mostly?
all night?
Does that have a negative effect on plants?
I think it is.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, that might have some effect on plants. I think it has a worse effect on just on human sleep cycles,
Yeah.
animal sleep cycles and things
Human-
like that.
Yeah.
Where they expect a dark night to reset biorhythms. Right.
Some of the first work back in the 1930s, by one of my former professors at Duke, was on the effect of streetlights on the plants around them.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
you can really see that on city
Yeah,
streets.
Yeah, yeah. Because Paul Kramer, you probably, you've heard the name.
I've heard the name.
Yeah.
And do they grow more with more light or?
I don't know, you ought- I
Well,
think they-
what you can notice in the fall is a lot of deciduous trees will keep their green leaves around streetlights later into the fall where other trees around them are senescing and dropping their leaves.
Interesting.
But that's all I had on EQ.
EQ. Right. Housing element. Right. You under housing?
Is this the one where you wanted to change clusters?
No, that was,
Oh no, that was residential clustering, never mind.
well, that was clustering of trees. Replace,
Right.
Some collective with row.
Residential clustering is.
You mentioned something about the parking lots. Mark.
Oh. Well,
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
What was the question today?
Didn't you mention something about the parking lots
Parking lots?
and wanting trees?
yeah, that's,
Ways to-
I wanted to bring that up later. I was gonna bring that up under economic development, but I'm not sure where it goes.
I don't
But I
know,
think we wanna,
The idea of improving tree coverage
in the
in
parking.
in parking lots.
business areas.
Well, I would say in town center, but
Okay.
That's really
but it's town
the
center.
only place.
Yeah, but we talk about that now. Mark, I don't know where this would go, but I think we want to make a statement about getting more trees in the parking lot here at town center to reduce the heat island effect. And I don't know what part of the thing we should do that in, but I know at least Dick feels very strongly about it. And I was down in California last week and I saw, California's better than we are at driving right to the shady part of the parking lot.
Maybe land use, maybe back at the beginning at land use.
Sure, okay. Maybe we can go back there after we finish the next section then.
I could make a note, we could talk about it now, and
Okay.
the note could say, add a policy to one of the goals in land use about what urban heat exposure and parking lot trees and aesthetics.
Yeah, Dick has talked about putting trees in it's the city-owned part of the parking lot, but I was looking at a map today of the parking lot and the city-owned, and it can't be 5% of it.
No, it's a small park. It's just this little,
Yeah, but
It's
it's
right
like
out here.
10 parking places out here,
I think it's bigger than that, but it's,
maybe 20.
Yeah.
But it's not much more than 20. But anyway, for a 10-year plan, I think, I don't know, I've gotten more convinced about it the more you've talked about it, Dick. But for a 10-year plan, I'd like to see us push for a little, something more than just trees in the city-owned part of the town center.
I'm trying to recall too, the landscape design element of the town center plan that was worked on when I was on the council several years ago. I know there were improvements that were envisioned to the overall use of vegetation. Were called for, and I'm sure some of those included trees. I mean, it might be worth looking at what I don't know, like we could state something to that effect, there's certainly in a comprehensive plan as well. But I know that there was some effort to improve that in the design work.
Yeah, I don't recall since that parking lot got tabled.
Right.
In fact, I never looked at what they said about trees, but it is certainly, the town center has to be the biggest heat island.
Oh,
In
yeah.
the city, I mean, it's the only major heat island in the city.
We could,
You've been commenting that, you know, it can't do any good to the neighbors around.
oh,
there.
that's right, so the heat island effect isn't immediate, it extends out away,
Yeah,
because that
yeah.
hot air that's produced by the asphalt out here blows away into the neighbors, and so it raises the temperature of all the surrounding community. It's perhaps a statement, something like to reduce the extent of paved surfaces to mitigate, reduce the extent of exposed paved surfaces to mitigate the heat island effect throughout the community or something would.
You could say something like promote higher minimums for trees in parking lots or in new lots or something like that too. There's a lot of times in municipalities where they'll have like a minimum amount of tree wells you need to have for a parking lot of a certain size, or landscape beds, you know, so finding a way to just promote more or a higher number, you know, requirement of those.
Or an increased tree cover in parking lots is basically. I would call out town center specifically, maybe we just want to say parking lots, but. Town center is so much the elephant in the room.
Yeah, we could say parking lots over a certain area. We could cite that area big enough to be, to exclude anything but the town center.
Trying to recall, does our codes, does our ordinance say 15% for economic areas, for business areas?
Something like that.
I think it's 15%. I mean, we can always say, we always have something that would be to encourage increased use of trees and other vegetation and parking areas.
Yeah, I think that the 15% makes sense insofar as there's a lot of simply building structure here where there can't be trees, right? It's just the footprint of all the buildings in the town center. It's the parking areas where there could be more coverage. So if we just use a certain percent for the whole area, maybe we could be more specific about increasing the coverage or reducing the amount of exposed paved surfaces.
So but I think a lot of what I'm thinking would probably happen would be you'd have, you know, trees that hopefully would be bigger than the, you know, there would be paved surface under them,
Yes.
but they would be
Right.
creating some shade, so it's not so much exposed paved. It's exposed because it's not shaded,
Right.
but I would go straight to the thing and say plant trees.
Yeah.
And that will reduce the amount of.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of wording that would make it both explain why we want them, because it's promoting community values beyond just a parking lot.
Promote the planting of trees in parking lots. To reduce heat island effects, promote
Neighboring
cooling,
communities or something.
increase wildlife a little bit. For all the things we want trees for, parking lots are probably even more valuable than any place else, except maybe stream size.
Got something?
We got something you can work with, Mark?
Yes, we'll have a spot for it and suggested wording that you can fine tune.
Okay, thank you. Anything else in the economic development section?
We got an economic development, or we don't have, we move on. Sorry, I'm probably falling behind here.
We kind
We-
of table
Oh,
topic.
we were talking about economic development, and then we decided we were gonna actually put something in the land use element, so
So
we're now back to
We
economic
kind of
development.
skipped over housing.
perfect. I didn't, okay. Yeah, no.
On policy ED 5.2 under economic development, there's a series of bullet points there. And one of them, the second one says improve visibility and access to Lake Washington.
I don't like that visibility.
The visibility one is,
Yeah.
first of all, they seem a little like they're apples and oranges, right?
Mhm.
We want to promote access to Lake Washington, and the city's done a great job of that by acquiring the property that's going to be a city park here soon. But improving visibility, and whereas, and you could go down 2 bullet points and says preserve the city's tree canopy and green character. It's almost like those are contradictory, right? I mean, I have thought myself many times over the last 30 years that, gee, when you drive down Lake City or off away from Lake City to Lake Forest Park, you used to have this great vistas out of the Cascades, right? But those trees have grown up so much that now there's just an occasional little window where you might get a view of the horizon. And at times I regret that, and at times I say, wow, isn't it nice that we've got maturing
Trees are growing.
trees in this part of the city.
I'd be in favor of just removing visibility. there.
I second
Yeah.
that
I think that would,
entirely. Too many times it can be interpreted as
yeah, I think
reason to just. cut
I
things.
I don't think we want to be committed. I don't think, I agree, we don't want to say improve visibility.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, many of us who have views of the lake would not want to.
Want to have that denied, yeah, and that's.
Right,
fair.
but I don't want to improve visibility, I just want to keep it what it is.
Yeah.
Or, yeah. But somebody just topped the tree just downhill from us, and presumably improved visibility, but that was not the way to do it. Now, there any, I guess, yeah, some other time for any progress on that,
Maybe just strike visibility and
Yeah.
say improve access to Lake Washington.
yeah.
That's something I think everybody
Yeah.
can agree on.
Maybe even say continue to improve access, if take such a giant step.
Jumping back up to housing,
Sorry.
is there, no, it's all good, a reason? It seems like, H 2.3 is basically the same as the one we talked about earlier, LU 2.5. Am I missing something that makes those different, or a reason that it's in both places?
I think they get at the same thing, but they're in two related elements. So often you want to streamline the overall document so that it's not redundant. But in this case, a reference in housing and in land use may be appropriate.
And
So the context around it makes those make sense to have both. Just wanted to check.
we have.
It's one of those rare occasions where redundancy may be better.
There,
We have a lot of redundancy around trees are wonderful, I mean, that's must be
Yeah.
15 or 20 of you might say that one way or another. Or maintain the tree canopy because it's such an important part of our city.
Yep.
So, and I don't want to get rid of those redundancies, I like seeing that over and over
Yeah.
again. I think
Oh,
it's-
look, there it is again, in the bullet point under. Preserve the city's tree canopy and green character.
Yeah, no, it's. That's one of the reasons I enjoyed reading this so much, is this. Anything else under economic housing or economic development?
You can tell me to stop, since I'm gonna get my own crack at this, when the council can still look at it, but when you were looking at the tree report, the tree inventory. There's a big emphasis on the value of that there's a dollar value of all the trees in terms of how much carbon they remove. And so could that be put into the economic development element to recognize the economic value of the of the trees?
Good thought.
Yeah, I like that.
I think it can and it will. And the effort most appropriate may be the $500,000 commerce grant that actually starts right now, that's due next June. That has that wording in the scope. And so by December, we're gonna have a periodic update, quickly followed by a comp plan amendment. And we can't do it all at once, but the climate element really gets at those heat island, the valuation, the natural assets, and the council added specific wording to one section in the scope of work. So I know that we're going to fully discuss that area or topic at that point.
At that point, I was just looking back at the. Environmental quality, that quick point could be put in probably a lot of different places. Maybe it'd be a good idea, I didn't think about that when I was going through it, but. Promote. Do we have anything in here about? One of our missions, promote citywide recognition of the value of our trees, we promote. We say we want to do it, but do we have anything about voting understanding of their value?
I don't think there's anything in there to that right now.
And again, if you just told us now, I have no idea where it would fit best.
They're like a community education.
Yeah, we're heading in that direction. So if you had suggested wording, we could certainly, go down that path right now and park it in one of these elements. It's well supported in several elements, and then it would be fine tuned and based on study by next June.
Okay, so we push something up. I'll draft up a line or two and send to you.
That's perfect.
Basically just saying, that promote an understanding of the value of trees for air pollution removal and. Well,
Yeah. We'll find a spot.
By action item.
Stormwater retention.
Or, yeah, I'll just look at the report and. Yeah, eliminate the numbers and put in the values. Speak, by the way, Mark, do you have any idea when they're gonna get a sort of updated version of the report? They said anything?
I keep booting it every week, Monday to Friday, and then to the next Monday, hoping that the next email is an update that says, here's the new report, revised report. They're committed to it. It's at their cost. It will correct that error in the data. And wherever it is needed to revise in the report, they're doing that right now.
Yeah, actually, the data, it's all the things they sent us, there's one number needs to be corrected in the data. It's probably not the only number that's wrong, but the correction that they're making will actually change one number of the thousands of numbers in that table. But it's, it changes every number.
It's going in the same direction, but that report will supersede the one we already have.
And I've encouraged people in the tree board not to distribute it any further until we get an updated version.
Okay.
All right, so we're done with economic development. We don't have anything for the next items. Narrative on park, trails, and open space.
Well, let's see. Before we leave that, community service and public safety. Right. And there's a note here, fire prevention. I guess I don't recall our conversation, but I guess we did discuss that in our last meeting, right?
Yeah, we did. The consensus then that I remember was it deals with wildland urban interface. Those codes weren't adopted and won't be adopted in May or June by council, but the wording that we added to the scope of the climate element grant where we just RFQ'd and a consultant will come on board will include that. So the policies for WUI could be included in that climate element. That's fair game. That would then support later potential adoption of development regulations or building codes regarding WUI.
Looks like we want to put something here in this grand 30,000 foot document saying that, we're worried about fire.
Same category. It's coming with climate element for sure. If you want to park something and have wording to us for that section, and if it's general or broad enough at a policy level, we could certainly add it now.
But we say promote policies that.
Well, where do you think it would go? I guess would it be under this?
Public safety
somewhere?
Public safety. Where's marked fire prevention that in this community service and public safety.
Community services and public safety.
So just basically something indicates that wildland fire or urban fire is one of the things that we want.
Urban forest wildfire.
Urban forest wildfire
works. Urban fires, otherwise people think of structured fires.
And we want to promote education and
Policies.
we want
policies and practices.
policies to minimize
Mitigate or minimize.
Which may actually be not having trees close to houses, but.
or cleaning up debris, I guess.
It's not just tree removal either. It's like tree pruning around the house and proper tree selection, because there's certain trees that are just way more flammable than others, or things that are more fire resistant. I won't say fireproof, but and so removal is always the big one everybody immediately goes to it. There's a lot of different management things for maintaining defensible space around the home that you can do. I can kind of help write a one-liner for that one. If you guys want, just I've worked with the urban interface code a lot.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? I've already forgotten what else I said I would write about.
I didn't value
But
the tree
it's only
policy
valid.
language.
Oh.
I'll remind you.
Okay, so, all right, so good point, Joe, Mark, we do need to get some, so you're gonna take care of that, it'll be your action item, huh?
Mhm.
All right, does that take care of that? Can we move on to parks, trails, and open spaces?
It's just a point of information. It refers to parks, trails, and open space. What sort of trail system is this referencing? We have some trails in like Grace Cole and in 5 Acre Woods. There's a Brook Dillon Trail, but that's not what think that this is in reference to.
The language itself comes from state law, like the state law says parks, trails, open space.
Okay.
You know, we have interconnector trails, they're bike trails, or they're, I guess they're routes, but they're for the share-ons that are intended for mark the connectors between the Virgil and the interurban, for example.
But that would be along a street or something, right?
It's along a street, you know.
That's probably not a very good place to put it, I'm looking at PT3, to provide information and education about natural systems, there's somebody cruising down one of our streets following the Sharrows, hopefully doesn't want to read about stuff, so I don't want them to read about stuff.
I don't know how many of them are formal and or on public lands, but there's a number of places where there are trails through where streets don't go
Yeah,
straight through to
Yeah.
get like up to the reservoir, or there's a couple
that's right.
down just off Ballinger where streets dead end before they get back onto Ballinger, and there are little cut through trails around.
Pipeline,
What was that?
the pipeline, true. Sounds like true.
Who has done the signage that's in Grace Cole? There, I think I'm right, Grace Cole, there's a nice little boardwalk out and there's some signs along the way talking about, the city did it. That's one example of doing what they're talking about here. And it's a good place for it.
And we're gonna add stewardship foundations, add something like the be working with the city. I think
That's really great. Having meetings. The Stewardship Council does enough stuff that overlaps with us, it's really,
it's a good learning experience. I hope you don't mind each other.
no. Okay, parks, trails, and open spaces, anything else?
Well, I was kicking around an idea, I see what you, and it's under signage, PT 6. And it had to do with, my thought was, I really like to see little labels on trees. You know, that tell you what they are.
This is PT6,
I
and
agree.
other document. we
It's
have.
about, you know,
Especially for new people who come to the area from another
yeah,
location.
yeah, so anyway, I was thinking of something along like provide identifying labels for key trees. Or select trees or something in city parks.
One way would be to choose one park perhaps and do a series of labeled trees on it so that if someone went there, they would see a lot of them. Rather than having one here, one there. Throughout all the city parks.
Like, I get people organized to go to this park, if you want to learn about trees, you go to this park, I guess. I would prefer, I guess, to have a few key trees labeled,
In each
Yeah.
park or something.
yeah, across the different parks.
I feel like what you're referring to also falls under 4.3, use the city's parks, trails, and open spaces to provide information and education about natural systems.
Yep, exactly what it is, yeah. Yep.
Including
Including,
identification.
So maybe just add, including,
tree identifying information.
And I was actually curious if that was one that we wanted to change the language to make it broader instead of just using the city's parks, trails, and open spaces to provide information, to make it include some of what tree board is tasked with in terms of community education initiatives as well. It seems like a place that a few word changes in that sentence could make it broader instead of just do it in the parks too.
It's a section about
Including
parks, right?
Yeah,
It is about parks and trails and, the parks seem to be the point of departure for the information here.
I'm just thinking changing the word, even just changing the word use at the beginning of that, like that implies to me that you have to use the park as the mechanism for education instead of general education about our parks, open spaces and trails.
So you got a thought about how you reword it, Victoria?
I mean, I would just, even just flipping it around, taking the word use out and starting with provide information and education about natural systems, including the city's parks, trails and open spaces.
But the point of this
me-
section though is using those as a place to put your natural. To me, this reads, I actually like the way it reads. It says parks, trails and whatever it is.
Should be education.
Are great places to put signs about the thing.
That's fair.
That's sort of what I read this to say. Take advantage of these places where people go because they want to be outdoors and.
It's a good example. We actually used it in draft language today, trying to get funding for Lakefront Park. And one of the questions was, how is this supported in your community development efforts? Who benefits? This is an example of who would benefit from a project or an idea in a project. That education element.
Wonder if there's anything in the environmental quality that get that in a broader way.
I just had it on my mind because you were talking about educating the community about specifically the economic benefit of our canopy. But to the best of my knowledge, the rest of kind of what we've been tasked with around educating the community isn't necessarily captured.
Again, this seems, as Larry said, it's a 30,000 foot thing. and
Yeah,
Take advantage.
every bit of
this
everything won't be in there, but I was seeing if it might be a natural fit, but it seems like it's got a distinct purpose that it is serving in another place. So that makes sense.
Moving on, anything else? Before we get to background analysis?
I think do we really care about removing trees when topping is the choice by the utility system? I defer to you guys, but
Which one do you do?
I'm sorry, utility.
The policy you for the utilities.
Yeah, it actually says to remove the tree instead of top it,
Well, certain trees just should not be topped because they're
right?
Yeah.
damaging to the trees, like conifers, for example.
Yeah,
Other trees
a
can
top tree is arguably no tree at all in my eye.
No, I understand. I'm just wondering if there are other solutions. I guess it says when topping is otherwise required. But is
Maybe
there something that decides?
something like work we'd like to do to encourage appropriate trees for growth in power lines, under power lines, something like that. I know, I have a colleague at Cal Poly who worked with the city of Los Angeles to develop a system of what trees are appropriate to grow under power lines.
Right.
You know, because throughout the city, they have a huge issue with people planting trees that are too big under power lines, or the city even planting trees that grow too big under power lines.
And it says to ensure the trees are replaced with location appropriate species. At that point, but for somebody either planted a tree 30 years ago or planted a power line 30 years ago. Yeah, man, riding along the Burke Gilman, sorry, just a second, riding along the Burke Gilman, there's a whole section between here and 165th where they've had to top these trees repeatedly because they are growing, I mean, they're tall trees and they go right up the power line.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know if we want those trees taken out. There's not a good choice. I mean,
Yeah,
taking out trees this big in diameter is not an attractive thought at all, but butchering them is not very attractive either.
yeah.
So I don't,
I just wanted to bring our attention to it,
yeah,
if there's anything we wanted to do.
right there.
My interpretation of U 4.6 is that if you have a tree that's right under a power line and you top it, you're not solving the problem permanently, because in a few years, the tree is going to grow taller again At the same time, it does feel like a one size fits all solution when the comp plan is pretty nuanced otherwise. So maybe there's a way to make the language, tweak the language to be remove or top trees as necessary near power lines.
Work with electric utilities to assess all options when existing trees interfere with maintenance of power lines or something.
Gary, do you have thoughts on this? I think it's pretty much your bailiwick.
I mean, yeah, the point about like conifers or what we would call excurrent growth trees where they have just one central straight lead. There's just no way to get around it other than topping, whereas decurrent trees, a lot of our like shade trees and deciduous trees and some conifers are more growing out and you can directional prune away from the lines more so, and that's an option. So it's kind of like if you're going through your toolbox as an arborist and you can't make heading cuts, you can't do directional pruning, you can't do any of these, and the only option is because it's excurrent tree, top of that, that's going to create a maintenance nightmare long term. And also where that cut is a huge entry point for decay. So now you've got maybe 5 leads coming out of that central part. They're all at risk to fail and probably an area with a lot of people. So I think it's the long-term maintenance and safety concerns with topping trees. And you can reduce the height of a tree heavily without topping it. Topping is like an indiscriminate kind of non-thoughtful choice. So there's a lot of like ways to manage growth other than that, but I'd say for the most part, if your option is that a tree truly needs to be just whacked at a terrible location and topped, it's probably not a good idea to leave it there for public safety and long-term health of the tree reasons. Yeah.
I think the last phrase in this statement is important. It says, ensure that trees are replaced with location appropriate species, and that's where the removal and replacement is a better solution than topping. Yeah, in many cases.
So, Drew, maybe you know about this. I'm trying to recall, are there not kind of best practices established for utilities to follow when they're doing kind of work?
Yeah, ISA has a whole guide to utility best practices. It's referenced in our code as well under the utility sections. And again, that's a lot of talking about a lot of these things, directional pruning, heading, like when it's appropriate, percentage wise, and things like that. And kind of a little different step from the normal ISA pruning standards of, what's practical under power lines.
And is that consistent with the idea of not topping?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, doesn't our code say that trees are not to be topped?
Yes. We consider topping a removal.
Yeah.
Because it's not expected to continue on having a good life once that action's taken.
It's hard for me to imagine how these trees got planted under the power lines, or how the power lines got planted over the trees. But I mean, I almost wonder in some cases it might be easier to move the power line.
Well, a lot of times too, when they're doing larger developments, power lines sometimes aren't just shown on site plans. And so sometimes you have landscape designers or landscape architects, putting stuff places, not even realizing there's a power line above it. It happens fairly frequently. Or just, thinking about it because they're just looking at overhead site plans on a CAD drawing. Sometimes you get rogue people planting just, stuff, and there's a lot of different ways it can happen, but I'm trying to avoid it by having like a good list of small trees, which we do, have a small tree list, like that's helpful. And PSC has a really good plant palette as well for stuff under power lines. I know
this is one of those historical problems, that somebody did something stupid 40 years ago. We have to figure out how to deal with something that's done there. In the case, again, going back to Burke Gilman, it may well have been that somebody thought they were just planting some shade trees so they wouldn't have to be right next to the Burke Gilman about 40 or 50 years ago when the Burke Gilman was put in. And it seemed like a great idea, something they were thinking maybe 3 or 4, 6 or 8 feet. And the power people said, oh, it's public property, the one in Burke Gilman won't put a power line here. And now 30 years later, those two ideas don't work well together, don't play well together.
I did have something I just typed up too for wildfire mitigation, not to like completely change the topic. I just threw it in the chat and I can read it. It can totally be worked, but thought this might be someplace to start. Just promoting fire mitigation measures within wildland urban interface areas through vegetation management, plant selection, and building forest resiliency.
I want to say promote wildfire mitigation measures.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it, but I think wildfire mitigation measures would be clearer.
All right, perfect.
Do we really have anything that qualifies as wildland urban interface in Lake Forest Park?
Yeah, your house.
DNR took the map down.
And then we have
So
some parks that are forested, but
Yeah, we do.
they're
We just
parks.
don't have the hazard mapping yet, and that's why the codes aren't adopted.
Okay.
But I would think, couldn't a fire burn right through your yard?
Oh, sure. I mean, it could burn anywhere that
With
there's.
with the right elements, a fire can burn anywhere.
But I think of wildland as large, non-urban areas that are undeveloped.
Right, but I think what Drew is talking about, and what I've heard Scott Baker talk about, is in an area like you are, fire could burn right through there.
Yeah.
I mean, it would not burn through my neighborhood, the trees are too scattered.
Yeah.
But he's just picking the word wild, whether that's wild land.
No, it's wildfire.
It's heavily forested.
But it's
Yeah.
wildfire.
it's the wildland urban interface. So it's that area between the wildlands and the high density urban areas, where the two kind of like meet. And so it's kind of, that's calculated what that zone is. They're changing the formula a little bit for the state, and DNR is working on these new hazard maps, but it depends on slope, vegetation cover, percentage, and density of housing. There's a whole bunch of factors that go into it. And so the state is mapping that with input from like counties, and some local jurisdictions, but largely we're going to have to wait and see. And there was a lot of really surprising areas mapped as wildland urban interface at that first iteration of the map that they put out.
So would like the areas along Ballinger Way be mapped as wildland urban interface? Could they?
I don't know where it was mapped in Lake City because I wasn't here yet, but the entire island of Bainbridge was mapped, even our
I think it's more
downtown.
pockets. It's more pockets. Whereas like Newcastle, Issaquah, Cougar Mountain is not pockets at all.
Right. Yeah, like that, and that's, I guess, really, I guess when I'm taking the after Dick's point, it's not exactly wildland, but it's very flammable land.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, wildland urban interface does not sound like what we're talking about here. We've got forest out here and a house built right up against the forest. But we still have a problem, even though it's not the wildland urban interface.
And I guess my sense is that Lake Forest Park is a city. Therefore, it is urban, period.
Right.
And a wildland urban interface would be one where there is a city and then adjacent to it is wildland.
Right.
And that's where the interface comes. Whereas
And it may be that it's low risk, and some of the measures that eventually are adopted are more structural, for venting and eaves and materials as opposed to vegetation.
Certainly our parks are big enough to qualify as forest fire habitat if it comes to that. It'd be analogous to wildlands.
Yeah. But I think the point that we're gonna have fires in our cities in a way we haven't been 30 years ago is something we could probably ought to recognize and be a little more careful about it. Because as beautiful as our forests are, we get any more of these dry summers,
We get dry.
and these cold winters that might kill off a lot of trees in our area. You put those two together and we have fire hazards that didn't exist a while ago. I'm not
Are we okay with Drew's draft at this point, or do you want to search further?
Can you
I like
put it back up again? Sorry.
You want me to put it up again? Sorry.
We've got it up.
We've got it up.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then
What's the chat?
That looks good.
Okay, yeah. Hope that the people think about it broadly and understand it's not just the classic wildlife forest. Yeah, because the measures that are proposed at the true wildfire urban interface are the kinds of things we need to do. Yeah. It's just, it's not really, as you said. Great, thank you, Drew. All right. Moving right along. Good. Anything in the? I had one comment in the background analysis, but does anybody else have anything before we get to the background analysis? Volume 2. Have any more comments?
I was pose a question to everyone. Are there any topics that haven't been addressed? Like, I know Mark added a couple of things, or so is there anything you think is missing?
This is one thing that I'm just not familiar with this area, so I don't know about. It might not be applicable here, but do you have any sense of if there are culturally modified trees or any like in indigenous, supported like trees around in Lake Forest Park? I know there were some like established pathways through this area. I thought most of them were more towards Seattle. But if there is, or you're at all thinking about that component of it, that might be something to introduce to a certain section. If you think there might be historic or culturally modified trees from anything tribal related in the community.
Yeah, a couple of us in the community have been working with a guy named David Brugge. He's a local historian. He's written a book about the Seattle, Chief Seattle and the city named for him. And he's been looking at that issue, and we talked the trails you talked about and different ways the land was used by native people. And I'm not aware of any of those kind of trees that exist anymore in Lake Forest Park, or I think there are some kind of in the North Seattle and maybe Northeast Seattle area.
The one in Wedgewood's got a lot of publicity.
Wedgewood, yeah.
It's hard to imagine Native Americans didn't use this north end of the lake.
Oh, yeah.
It's managed flu coming in and things like that. It's a natural place for a village, but the specific tree issue, yeah. Nice if he found something, or maybe it wouldn't be nice, I don't know. Be interesting.
Yeah, he's working on a history of this part of this north end of the lake. It's hard to write a history about just this area without it being regional, and it's kind of a bigger scope for people that live here. But anyway, your question, I'm not aware of anything like that either.
Would you like to add a policy just in case, proactively?
Sure. If there were such trees, or
maybe a place to do that is in the when we talk about later this summer or next year or sometime, changing the definition of an exceptional tree. You might be able to make some kind of a reference there to culturally modified trees. We could just call them exceptional trees. They get the same high level of protection that because they probably would be big. I mean, if they're culturally modified by the Native Americans, then they've been around for a while.
Yeah, it also could potentially go under historic preservation. I don't know if that's a different element that we just haven't touched anything on at all, Mark. But like a lot of times that stuff's roped into the archaeological discovery stuff and historic preservation commission things as well.
Yeah, we have it at regulation level, inadvertent discovery, etc. I'm not sure we have anything at policy level, and I don't want to guess at what a tribe's review comment on the comp plan would be, or ecology. So I don't think policy hurts because it is that broad level. But we are, with conditions on a project, we already have through SEPA or the project approval conditions requiring inadvertent discovery, archaeological finds, and so forth.
Okay. So
it may be worth
like
adding here, either that or later on at some other time. I don't see a downside if you want to entertain it.
If people want to read it, it's land use goal 8 is historic preservation.
What is it?
That's it.
That's not what we had here, right?
No, it's in the full comp plan.
Yeah. I'll go to that. Man, this is a lot. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, land use, compatibility, residential. Just, yeah, land use goal 8. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4 policies, none dealing with specifically trees.
So.
The most,
Go for it.
the most relevant support, no, community organizations. Yeah, there's really no specific policy, to go one level besides trees, about cultural resources and so forth. So that'd be a good spot.
So something like preserve and protect identified natural features and resources of cultural and or historic importance.
Can you write that down? Because if I were reading that in there right
Oh,
now.
I've
that'd
already
be-
forgotten it.
That was so good too.
That was good. Yeah, that would capture it at that high policy level.
Good. Take it, did you take it for yourself?
Elizabeth did. We're all
Yeah.
on recording.
Now we have to go back and watch the tape because it is recorded.
I'll work on getting something down and shoot it to you.
Okay. That'd be, and I'll flag it for somewhere in goal LU8.
Elizabeth, if you need to re-listen to it, it was at minute 23.
Yeah, no, that's
All right. Moving along then, background analysis on environmental quality and shoreline. I had one comment here, but 3/4 of the way down the page, it says, talks about the tree canopy map that was done in 2009. We now have a new one done in 2016. So certainly if you want to include a figure, you should include the newest figure. Hopefully we'll have a new one again next year, but at this point.
And then SCJ may already have that in their review draft. And in essence, anything that's cited as a report or graphic, an exhibit, a table gets updated to the most current. But I could flag this in particular in relation to the comment about grabbing policies from the DCG watershed iTree report.
Oh, this is not the iTree report. This is a different one. This is the canopy report done from LiDAR measurements.
Oh. Can you give me the title of that? I don't know that I've read that.
You probably haven't because it's kind of a long story. I don't think they ever really submitted a final report. They sent us letters and they sent us pictures and they sent us files, but there was never really a nice final report that said what you wanted to know. Probably the people who did it got bought out by somebody else, and we could talk about it at some point. But there is a 2016 canopy analysis that says quite clearly, that we have, it shows quite clearly that we've had a 4% increase in canopy cover since this 2009 analysis.
Okay.
But it's hard to reference, but hard to track down. I mean, it's kind of unforgivable that anybody paid the final check on it, frankly.
As long as it exists.
But
As long as it exists. Yeah, we're good.
Okay, but anyway, we just should refer to the most recent version, and I'll try to get you some information on that, I guess.
Okay.
But it's really, it's a lot. It was a huge amount of work. They did a beautiful output, except they just never wrapped it up in a final package. I think that I know of, and it may just be that nobody ever passed it on to me because I wasn't on the board or anything. And so I just got what Steve Bennett sent me. Okay, so that's anyway. So that should be updated. That's the end of my comments. Anybody else have comments on any of the rest of this? Probably still in pretty good shape on the other time.
Yeah, it's 6:25.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you all.
Mark, do you have any questions for the tree board? Anything you want to clarify before you make the necessary decisions?
The only bit of uncertainty is I still have that mental note. There are at least 2 policies in the DCG watershed report that I think could go in here. At that time of reading the report, it occurred to me they weren't already in there. That's the only uncertainty. So I flagged it as a note. In the next version, I'll take a stab at it, whatever they are. But there are no other issues or items I can think of.
Did one have to do with larger trees?
Yeah, I don't remember. I knew enough not to forget that there was an issue.
No, the one thing they really did point out though was, and I don't think we had this anywhere in here. Thank you for that. Discourage the planting of trees that are gonna get sick from something and die soon. That's not quite the phrasing they had. That's not the phrasing we want to use, but
Yeah.
discourage the planting of trees that have known pathogens that are expected to be, either are already serious or expected to become serious. And again, maybe Drew, you probably could phrase that better than anybody, because you're more familiar with what they are, but don't plant ashes that are gonna get, emerald ash borer is gonna get here soon. It will kill them. Don't give it a food source. Don't plant white birches. What is it? Bronze birch borer there? Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we can come up with something.
That's, yeah, something to supply that if we know a pest is in the area, we should not be planting trees that feed that pest. Or that, yeah. that will
Yeah,
die
work
because-
on something about working on pest readiness and adaptability, based on pest.
We've got a climate change in there, which is kind of part of it, but these new pathogens that don't plant white pine. It's a wonderful tree, but it gets white pine blister ruts and goes. And there's quite a lot of we've had this discussion with regard to the tree list. Easily. But it wouldn't hurt at all to put something in the plan to discourage the plant, to look forward by discouraging the planting of things that are susceptible and known to be at high risk.
Yeah, promote something maybe about promote long-term planning for pest disease and climate change. Would that be too broad?
Yeah, something like that, maybe. I mean, we've talked a lot about invasives, but obviously getting rid of invasives, not planting them. It's a separate issue. But this is the other issue that they raised and that Tim Bone raised, that there are some trees that's not very smart to plant. It wouldn't hurt to recognize that in this comprehensive plan, I don't think.
Or with expected fragility due to climate change.
Well, there is EQ 9.5. EQ 9.5 says encourage the study of potential effects of climate change to native trees and develop strategies to adapt or mitigate the likely effects. That seems like it's getting at that idea.
It's getting at that. It's some of these things are not climate change. They're just a pest that is developed that has gotten here finally.
Invasive, they're
Yeah.
invasive pests as opposed to
Invasive
invasive
pests.
plants. Right?
Yeah,
But they're not benefiting from increased temperature.
In some cases, they might be, in other cases, they may have just
Yeah.
arrived and
yeah. They-
found something to their liking.
Yeah, like white pine blister ruts have been devastating the high altitude forests for decades now. It's not really because they're getting wet, it's just because white pine blister.
It's like the elm disease.
Yeah, Dutch elm disease.
Dutch elm disease in the eastern US, and with climate change had nothing to do with it, it just arrived from
Got here.
Europe or Asia, wherever it originated. And
But
just
it's
ran through the elms.
And chestnut blight is an earlier example. There's a lot of examples of diseases that weren't doing too much damage in there, wherever they came from, but somehow got here and found.
So there might be something, there might be another point under EQ 9 that gets at that type of.
Maybe that could be,
Pathogen.
yeah.
So encourage the study of potential effects of climate change and invasive pathogens to native trees and develop strategies to adapt and mitigate.
That'd be the simplest way to change it. Yes.
pop something in there, expanding the scope.
Not just climate change, but it's other.
Just climate change and invasive pathogens or whatever the correct terminology would be.
Say, Drew, invasive pathogens, is that?
Well, it's like it's annoying because there's an and there, but like pests and disease is kind of the standard way to say it. Just because, you know, like the insect pests don't really get covered under pathogen.
Emergent is the word I was looking for. Emergent pests, emergent.
Climate
Yeah.
change and emergent
Emergent.
pests and pathogens
Yeah.
or something.
There was a whole section of that on that in the tree inventory.
Yeah,
document.
that's
So this
that's how we got started on this. Yeah. I think emergent covers the fact that they're emerging.
Yeah.
Can you? that's a-
Somebody
that's
get
a-
that in notes?
Yeah, that's a pretty simple edit. You just go ahead and add that one. Okay, great. Okay. Anything else? Thank you for pointing that out, Mark. All right. IVL recap. Mark, thank you for all your help in putting this together, and Elizabeth for all your help in taking notes and getting these changes made.
Are you okay if the three of us, based on whatever we receive and of what we talked about here, create this next draft, circulate it, and then have a final sign off on the first week of June?
It's on the three of you, meaning you and Drew and Elizabeth.
Yes.
Sounds
Three
good.
people are getting paid to do this.
Yes. Just
Yeah,
time
I won't
wise,
be here with it. Yeah,
if
I won't
we-
be here, but-
yeah, we know where we're heading as far as these comments, and we could update the planning commission. We have time to incorporate it in with SCJ, no problem there. If we know that the next tree board meeting beginning of June is kind of like we have a final version, then we're well on track.
So if you can,
Okay. And you'll get that to us before the meeting, of course, so Doug would have a chance to look at it.
well, I'm not sure how long it'd have to be. Can't recall when I leave. I'm going to system.
Oh. So, well,
If it's a week ahead of time, I can do it though.
Yeah, we
You
can
guys,
do that.
you guys particularly have heard my comments and you know what I'm getting at. You've all had really.
Which channel you in the meeting?
Yeah, you all have the meeting. So. Yeah, I'm not sure how early it would have to be to get ahead of the final packing.
How long did we go?
3 weeks.
sounds good.
Okay.
All right. Arbor Day recap.
It was great.
That was very good.
A well-attended event where we accomplished an impressive amount of ivy removal.
How long did you guys stay there?
We were there from 11 when the event started. Actually, Mark was there from like 10.
Yeah.
And set up the canopy and started removing ivy before any of us got there.
Yeah.
We were all working before you had it.
We were, yeah, and then we kicked off the demonstration part of the event at 11:30. And we had several guests. How many are on this?
Yeah, we had 5 folks plus 2 folks through the Stewardship Foundation, John and your son, correct?
Smart fun.
Your son, sorry.
There's a number of greeners in the group.
Yeah. My
Husband.
And then we also, right, who's not on my list?
Yeah,
Um,
sorry.
and then one of our former tree board members as well,
Who was that?
Marty Byrne.
Oh, yeah.
Several questions at the time of the demo. I think we successfully reported it. John circulated the video. Victoria kindly offered to edit it so that we could get it up on the website eventually.
I didn't know birds could be so loud.
This
That tape,
time of year.
I haven't looked at the video yet to see
Oh,
how
yeah.
much we got done.
Sure, there's something that can be done.
Yeah,
You know, would have benefited by practicing it once.
I know. Yeah, I mean, if it's deemed, not good enough for a website presentation, Mark and I can meet up and do a demo.
We could do another one if you think it's important.
Exactly.
But I thought the great benefit of the event was the stuff we did beforehand. I mean, I think it was important, just the communication with the public. Publicizing the event and also mentioning the problem of ID and why we should remove it. I think that's where we got the most mileage out of it, was just kind of distributing that word pretty widely.
Yeah, it was heard about through the Green Fair.
Yeah, we got
through-
2 folks who said they heard about it through the city email, 1 through Shoreline Area News and 1 through the Green Fair. So
So all our efforts were.
good to hear that the scattershot approach seems to have worked.
And the other great part of it is we have these materials now that
Yeah.
we didn't have.
So what's become of the document you put together? Is that, we have a plan for you? to get?
Feedback, we handed it out during the event. We can,
Is that something we
Do
can
more.
post on the city website?
Oh, might be.
For download?
Might be to take a look at it with that in mind.
that's, I think all I had for recap. There were refreshments. We
Yeah.
donated the rest of the refreshments to the church.
Good refreshments.
Or Camp United.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, John.
So my understanding is, so we're a Tree City USA city, and one of the requirements is we have to have an annual Arbor Day event, which this is. So will staff be sending that to the Tree City USA Foundation so that like to renew our Tree City status for next year?
So yeah, you apply usually at the end of the year for the status, because they're looking at that year. So like we'd apply in November, with all the data from this year, so that they can say with that, yes, for 2024 you were. So we just kind of keep that in mind, and we have to have the proclamation as well. And then once we have all the information on how much money we spent on all the categories and all that at the end of the year, then we send our application in. That's usually how it goes. So
Yeah.
it's noted.
You happen to know if anybody did that last year, who were between? You did,
Yes.
they did?
Yes, I think it was Phil. Someone did it for sure from the city. So we have status from last year. But I imagine I'd probably be taking that over now.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the city clerk finished it off in November, and we have yet another year in our lengthy history. We actually did an update, and the day after we had the proclamation or the announcement at city council, it came up at leadership team, and I was at that city council and was completely oblivious to what it was. So, but we did do it. We added another year. This November, we intend to reapply, do the same thing, and add another year.
It just occurred to me that was sort of in our interim when, I don't think you were on board yet, Mark. You certainly weren't, Drew, and you might have been Elizabeth at that point.
I think my recently started.
But it just started, so it's a miracle it got done. Congratulations, everybody who was involved.
This sort of triggers the question, are there other recognitions like that we would want to pursue? Outside of like Tree City, are there other sort of tree oriented recognitions that we would want for the city that are available? That we don't have?
There is the wildlife city designation or something, backyard wildlife designation you can get for individual homeowners can have. And I think if you have a certain proportion of the city where with individual homeowners who have gotten that categorization, you get something as a city. And I thought Lake Forest Park achieved that some years ago. And I don't know if that's something that needs to be kept up or what.
Lisa?
Yes, we did achieve that, and to renew that, you have to have, multiple events and things, and we haven't kept up with that because it's, it involves doing some different events, and in stewardship, we didn't have the bandwidth to really keep it going, but it's something we could pursue.
More on the So that's something to think about at some point and but it involved a number of events.
Okay.
Yeah, we did. You have to fill out a form. There's actually the state DNR, I think, has one
Oh, you're-
certification.
You guys,
Yeah,
that's,
your personal property. And then there's the National Wildlife Association, somebody who does one, so they're both similar.
we will.
So I have a kind of event wrap up logistics question is, so things like the sign-in sheet that we have, is that something that we should keep on file somewhere for any reason? Is that something that we're just like interesting information and now that can just get shredded? Similar, I took a number of pictures and we have the video and stuff. Is that the kind of thing that the city keeps on file anywhere or has like?
The picture we would
Okay.
want to keep for
Okay.
the Tree City USA
Okay.
application.
Yeah, so I provided cities for our Arbor Day, or pictures from our Arbor Day event last year.
Okay.
You or somebody last fall when they were putting that together.
I can send over a folder of the photos I took from the event.
Yeah,
I also think Corey Roach keeps track of volunteer hours. I know when we work in the parks, we send that info to Corey, so.
Okay.
I ask her.
Might be interested in knowing how many folks came out and pumped out.
Can you do that? Follow up on it? for you?
Sure, I don't think I have Corey's contact info, but Elizabeth, if you can put us in touch, I'd be happy to.
It's on city of LFP website. Search for Corey.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, and thank you guys for doing that. That was really, it was a cool event. And quite a lot of work setting it up.
I was just thanks to Stacy and to Victoria for the great work that they did.
And to you, Mark.
I was gonna.
Yeah, but these people have technical capability. They do stuff.
But you found us a place to do it, so that was important too.
That's
Oh, I got the on.
A good part of a year.
I definitely like removing some of the invasive stuff more than maybe adding a tree. It was nice to have the work party, because these Arbor Day events, they could be as short as 30 minutes, right? For sort of a ceremonial type of thing. But this gave us the opportunity to meet people and speak to them like more than we would at just a ceremonial event. We got to know some of our community members, which I thought was fantastic, actually.
Hey, climate policy advisory team discussion. I don't know what this is.
Either I can talk about it or want to talk about it.
Lisa, you still have your hand up if you want.
Lisa? Council member?
Sure. So the other boards, the Planning Commission and the Climate Action Committee also spoke positively about having a separate task force rather than tasking it to the actual committees themselves. And then at our meeting on the 25th, so last week, the city council approved the ordinance, and so the task force has been created. I keep calling it task force because the technical term is advisory team, same thing. And so it's up to 3 members from the planning commission, up to 3 members from the climate committee, 1 person from the tree board, and then up to 2 members of the public at large. Your task is basically to figure out who from the tree board is interested in doing it. And then I'll pass it off to Mark to talk about the logistics of how the committee will run. But basically your task for tonight, if you're ready to, is to figure out which of you would like to volunteer to be on the advisory team. Did you want me to go into what the goal of this advisory team? I know I talked about process. Did you want me to talk about what it is?
A brief refresher would be great.
Sure. So this year, we're doing the comprehensive plan update. In addition, the city got a $500,000 grant to do climate change resiliency as an additional section of the comp plan. Without this grant, we'd be in for a 2028 update for climate change. The grant will let us get it done, not this year, but next year, but that's still 3 years early. In order to do that, you've seen how much work goes into, and this is the tree part of the comp plan. So a lot of work goes into it. And so creating a brand new section about climate resiliency is going to be a fair bit of effort. And so the idea will be for this advisory team, the 3 committee task force, to come up with essentially the comprehensive plan section. In the same way that there's a housing element, there's an economic element, there will be a climate element. So this task force will come up with the climate change element and then show that to the individual committees, and the committees will approve it. And then it'll go to the city council to put it into the comprehensive plan. So that's the idea. So this advisory team would be drafting the climate resiliency element, which will be a brand new element for the plan. Mark, did I get that description right?
Absolutely. And then one added level, we have a request for qualifications out right now, publicly noticed through May 14th, I believe. Qualified consultant teams will apply. We will evaluate and recommend one. City council will decide which one, and then we'll negotiate a contract. That consultant would be responsible for the scope of work, and this policy advisory team would support that.
Or is the focus here mainly on preventing, shall we say, climate change, what we can do to reduce our contribution to climate change, or on surviving it, or
Well,
adapting? What's gonna happen? I mean, they're really
yeah,
two
resilience,
separate things.
adaptation, exactly. Yeah, and so it creates the climate element. It's a new goal of the Growth Management Act. The existing climate-related policies in our comprehensive plan either remain where they are or get grafted into it. The 500,000 grant is very specific. It includes a vehicle miles traveled study, includes a greenhouse gas study, includes a resiliency sub-element, and then some local policy that's reflected in our climate action plan that's before the council this May. And so it establishes the policy for each city. And so at a broad level is, yes, what is this jurisdiction going to do to minimize, avoid, adapt, live with climate change?
So it's really both things, minimizing it and surviving it.
And how, not just that a broad policy that, hey, we will, but measures as to how.
But the measures you do to reduce CO2 emissions are different from the ones you do to try to make sure you don't plant trees that are gonna die next Thursday. From drought.
But one item that was added to the scope of work that's in the grant agreement with Commerce deals with the valuation, the resource of trees, the natural character of the city, valuation as an asset. And so we'll look into that, both function and any way that it can be studied and included into the policy.
So
So that for tonight, the item is who's interested? Generally, it's once a month.
Did we have an estimate on time commitment?
I think the expectation would be similar to the tree board, so it would be one meeting per month, roughly 2 hours, so 2 hours per month. It's possible there might be a crunch time next spring as we get close to the deadline, but the goal is one meeting per month.
Excellent.
Will your staff help to get that together?
And so part of the grant will pay for a contractor because staff is going to be very busy getting the actual comp plan up and running. And so this gives us the money to hire an outside consultant to essentially run the committee. Also, the plan is in the same way I'm the liaison to this board, Lori Bodie is the liaison to the planning commission. A council member would be the liaison to this advisory team. So that way there would be a link between the advisory team and city council.
And would we expect that the 2-hour meeting is likely on a weeknight?
Yeah, I think we can expect, pretty much every city meeting is on a weeknight, whether it's like city council is Thursdays,
Yeah.
tree board is Wednesday, so.
I know there was a comment last time that weeknights are getting pretty booked for some people, slash the Zoom account.
Yeah, I think the expectation is a lot of people have regular 9-to-5 jobs, they have families, and so coming up with the date and time that's most likely to work for as many people. So yeah, it would most likely be a weeknight.
Great.
So, yeah, Mark, what's the time frame? When do you want to see this committee established?
Well, the RFQ due date is May 14th. Then a week or two of evaluation interviews leading towards a recommendation. And I believe that timeline includes June and July for negotiation of a contract. Then a consultant's on board, so it's pretty quick. If we could form an initial policy advisory team by using May and June, the process is that the interested parties are forwarded to the mayor for makeup. We need at least 5. 9 is the top limit. We have some flexibility on who makes it up, and it includes residents, not just tree board, planning commission, and CAC. So if tonight this discussion is the very first opportunity to ask this question. Next week, planning commission has a meeting on the 8th, and on the 14th, we'll know from them. They're very busy. They saw it as favorable. I'm hoping that we get at least a couple of them to commit to this on top of their planning commission work. And then I believe next Tuesday is the next CAC meeting we'll have. So for tonight, if we just know who's interested, we can start down the path of knowing a potential makeup or consistency of what this team could be.
And would the plan be, Mark, to have that team evaluate the RFQs and participate in the selection process for that consultant?
If it came together, in that order, then I'd see no reason why. The first order of business would be to establish an initial meeting, elect a chair and a vice chair, and start agendas. But we can't afford to wait on the timeline for the RFQ. So this being the first night to ask an existing committee who's interested, my hope is it starts to come together really quick over the next 2 weeks, and then we can make those kind of decisions.
Who is interested? Victoria, you're asking questions about it. Interested, Ray.
Last week.
I am willing to participate. I feel like I have capacity as long as it's weeknights. I'm not in town on weekends. So if it does end up getting kicked to weekends, that gets hard for me.
I guarantee it won't be on a weekend.
Great.
Won't be able to get it.
My only concern, I love doing like drafting and wordsmithing, kind of my jam. But I am not the expert in like what is best practice or recommended practice around climate policy and trees. So if there is someone who is willing to participate, who feels more qualified to advise from that perspective, by all means. If no one wants to do it, I'm perfectly happy to be there.
Is Drew also gonna be part of it or no? I mean, she's not hearing from. Oh, there
She just went off camera.
Sorry. Had to step away for a minute.
Question.
I have not talked to Mark about it at all yet. I don't know if there's any expectation. I mean, trees is kind of the only component of it that is probably primarily. I don't know what it looks like yet. So
Yeah, it won't be primary. I'll be the primary with whoever the consultant's going to be, but any expertise that resides in any city staff will be tapped.
Well, Stacey,
And I'll just make one comment. You don't have to be a climate element or climate change expert. This is a reasonable community member, reasonable, responsible volunteer to give it that kind of logical test. The expertise and detail will be provided.
I absolutely support Victoria and her volunteering, but
And I would also point out, this is not a legally binding contract. If you do this and you realize 4 months down the line, it's just not a good fit, you're welcome to step back and have another tree board member take this.
I'll back you up on that. I'll do it if you step.
You'll be my backup.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think you can probably call on, certainly Dick and me if it requires professional expertise, let's say.
And I
Okay,
believe part of the
group.
agreement is that I'll be the one sitting in the room to bring back and tell you all what we've talked about. So,
Yes.
happy to.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we now have 4 minutes left to do the next 4 items. Is there any new business? Good. Any reports or announcements? Good. Agenda for the next meeting, it will be presumably this.
Yes, I care about this now, if I'm going to be facilitating. So, what's on the agenda?
Comprehensive plan again.
We're gonna look at material, right, comp planning again. It's moving towards completion. Are there any other items? Anybody can think of that ought to be on that agenda? Sounds like a pretty lean meeting right now.
What was the time frame to come back to the idea of updating the tree list?
We've kind of decided to pull that till the comprehensive plan is done with.
Okay.
I thought, that was my thought
I
anyway.
hope, yeah.
Oh, that's Mark's fault.
It might be worth just scanning over the work plan to see if there's any items there that we want to elevate to either old business or new business, if it's something that we want to bring up to start working on.
I would love to chat about any potential outreach or community engagement opportunities we want to try to pursue this year. Because if we want to do anything like tabling at the farmer's market or setting up an info table in the
farmer's market
lakefront.
Worked so well, they did it a couple of years ago.
So if we want to do any of that, planning it in the next 2 months is,
Okay.
summer is gonna be the best time to do it.
Although they've only wanted us to do it at the very end of the year because during the summer, all of those booths are booked.
Yes, and that's,
But in the end, when people start dropping
a
out, they
lot
get.
of the market is already booked for the
Yeah.
season, it sounds like.
So
But
they were happy to have us take an empty table.
if we wanna
at the
try
end
to
of the season.
get in with the table at some point, we should start figuring that out soon. Or if there are other things we wanna do for community outreach over the summer is likely.
Doing that in the fall, I thought was fun, because that's a otherwise slow
Yeah.
time for us. It was a good time to do it.
I was gonna ask Elizabeth, I would like to have a copy of the work, the final work plan. I got my copy with notes and stuff on it, but the final version. of
Would
it-
you send the final version out to the whole tree board? You
Maybe
sent a copy to
everybody
me,
would like to-
Yeah,
recently, and,
Maybe everybody would like to.
Yeah.
Because we're gonna talk about it a little bit. Oh, good. Hope you have a nice
I
trip.
move we adjourn
Second?
before we get booted out of the building. Good job.
Thank you all.
8:59, hey, we
Thank
finished
you,
early.
guys.
Bye, everyone.